Welcome back to every naval battle in history. Today we're focusing on the Battle of Helgea in 1026, which featured a rare Anglo-Danish naval force taking on Sweden and Norway. What we know about the battle is minimal, so we're also going to focus on an underappreciated historical figure, King Canute, he who foolishly tried to order the tides, according to the stories which probably aren't true, we'll get into that. Or, as he was more understood in his own time, Canute the Great, King of England, Denmark and Norway, the founder of the North Sea Empire, and also King of some of the Swedes, which I always find amusing. Just as a short discourse, there was a naval war around this time between the Kievan Rus and the Byzantines. The Kievan Rus, of course, also being pretty much Vikings. But records of that are so sparse, there's not an episode to be made out of them. In my view, it's probably significant that the Vikings were keeping better written records than the Roman Byzantines by this time. Also worth noting is that from the eastern Mediterranean to northern France, the Vikings were everywhere in this period. But let's talk about Canute. Born in 990 and dead at age 45 in 1035, his life was one of remarkable achievement in a very short time. As a Danish prince, he would fight under the Raven banner that was the birthright of the heirs of Ragnar Lothbrok. That Viking guy from that show Vikings. Despite bearing the iconography of the great pagan army, Canute was a committed Christian and sought to integrate his kingdoms into Christian Europe. And when I say he was a committed Christian, he gave lots of money to the church and used ecclesiastical communication channels and relied on the literate clerical class to make his kingdoms function. In his personal lifestyle, he kept 2 wives, but if one gives enough money and power to the priests, it's amazing what they and the good Lord can forgive. Being around as young and successful as the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, they seem to have enjoyed each other's company, and Conrad would exempt Canute's subjects from paying tolls on the pilgrimage routes to Rome. Canute's achievement in uniting the Danish and English peoples of Britain under his crown is his lasting legacy. Because these two groups had been fighting bitterly for some time, Danish settlers had been living in England since around 865, with significant intermarriage with the Anglo-Saxons, as well as numerous massacres, ambushes and betrayals. The Netflix show The Last Kingdom does a passable job of setting this scene. In his lifetime, Canute also united England with the Kingdom of Denmark, and following the Battle of Helgea, he styled himself King of all England and Denmark and the Norwegians and some of the Swedes. But now we're getting ahead of the battle, so let's take a look at that. In 1026, Canute had been preoccupied with affairs in England, so what would his kin and friends in Norway and Sweden do? Raid Denmark, of course. King Olaf II of Norway and King Anund Jacob of Sweden, as the story goes, massed their fleet on the Helgea River, or Holy River, somewhere in Sweden. No one can agree today exactly where that is, or was, but we will persist. Canute sent his brother-in-law and prolific traitor, Ulf Jarl, in command of his Anglo-Danish fleet to deal with them. The Swedes and Norwegians had around 480 ships to the around 600 of Canute, but they had a cunning plan to even the odds. According to the story, they built a dam on the river, out of peat and lumber, and when Canute's forces entered the mouth of the river, Olaf and Anund's men destroyed the dam, sending a deluge of water racing down the river. It succeeded in destroying the English and Danish ships that had entered the river, but unfortunately for the Norwegians and Swedes, their timing was off and the bulk of Canute's forces were defected. Sometimes these things just turn on luck, and sometimes the luck is the caution of an admiral who doesn't commit his entire force into an unfamiliar river mouth. The Swedish and Norwegian kings announced they had achieved as much as fate permitted them to gain, and their forces ran away before a more conventional naval battle could develop. Purely in terms of losses, it was a disaster for Canute's forces, but in terms of forcing his enemies to flee and retaining the stronger fleet, it was a commanding success, a theme we see time and again. At Christmas Eve that year, Canute and Ulf would argue while playing chess, and on Christmas Day, one of Canute's housecarls would murder Ulf in the Roskilde church, later rebuilt as a cathedral. Which is not a great way to treat your victorious admiral, but Ulf's long history of side-switching was always going to catch up with him. 2 years later, Canute would add King of the Norwegians to his titles, along with some of the Swedes. In 1031, Malcolm II of Scotland pledged allegiance to Canute to further add to his titles, and the Norse settlements in Ireland, such as Dublin, also appear to have been well within Canute's sphere of influence, even if he was never a formal ruler there. Canute died on 12 November 1035 at Shaftesbury in Dorset. His son Harthacnut tried to rule as King Canute III, but the familiar interfamilial fighting of the Scandinavians broke apart Cnut's North Sea Empire. It's a great what if as to whether Cnut had lived for another 20 years, or if his sons hadn't fought each other, what if an Anglo-Scandinavian North Sea Empire had developed into an actual nation? Cnut's remains were interred at Winchester Cathedral, where they remained until they were desecrated by Cromwell's Roundheads in the English Civil War. Because once you start executing kings, I guess any king will do. His bones were mixed with the Norman King William II's on the floor of the cathedral, and without the benefit of DNA testing in the 17th century, the commingled sets of bones remain in mortuary chests in Winchester to this day. Now, before we go, what's the one story you'd heard about King Canute? That he tried to command the waves? It's generally considered these days that he was attempting to show to his courtiers that even the mighty warlord of the North Sea had limits to his power. However, I'd remind viewers that a very similar story about Caligula had been around in literate circles since Roman times, and the first written mention of Canute commanding the waves didn't appear until nearly 100 years after his death. The allegory should be read more that Canute's name was so well respected as a great king that a story about wisdom and foolishness could be hung on his name after his death. Strap in, folks, we've got lots more to cover as we take on every naval battle in history. Smash those like and subscribe buttons, ring that bell, you don't want to get left behind.